Hello, my name is Sean O'Reilly. I teach at AIU. I teach Japanese history and also Japanese cinema. Today we're talking about the Nichiro-senso, the Russo-Japanese War. Not the battlefield victories so much, but rather the tactics to some extent, and also the home front, how people are reacting to the war in Russia and also in Japan. Is there kind of broad unity in either of those places? And if not, what does that mean for the negotiations which end the war? You'll note the title is The Peace That Shook the World, because in some ways the treaty which ended the Russo-Japanese War was a very significant event in world history, maybe even more than the kind of battlefield victories. So we'll talk a little about tactics and then move into the kind of home front, eventually culminating in a kind of discussion of how the negotiations went in the kind of very end of the war. So that's the goal here. We'll talk specifically about a poem by Yosano Akiko, kind of remarkable poem, which was published in late 1904 during the war, and maybe like calls into question the unity of purpose of Russo-Japanese War era Japan. Normally in my classes, I also have this you see on the screen. It says next time. That's like a preview of what will be coming up in our next class. But also it's a way to connect the materials that we see today with what we're coming up, kind of next week or the next class. So that's kind of typical way to approach this kind of class. And obviously, our class would be in person, and there would be lots of small group discussion rather than just me talking. So anyway, one question my students often ask is, okay, why didn't the Japanese who had trapped the Russian fleet inside Port Arthur, this port, why didn't they just use torpedoes? Torpedoes, explode below the waterline. So if there's a hole in the ship, at the bottom of the ship, it will sink, right? So why not just use torpedoes? The Russian ships are trapped. They have nowhere to go. But it turns out that torpedoes are like completely unreliable at the time. They miss usually even when there's a stationary target. So it's not going to work so well to attack ships that are moving around inside the harbor. There was one kind of success by torpedoes. The Retvitsan, this Russian ship, was partially sunk by Japanese torpedoes during the surprise attack at the very beginning of the war. But the Russians repair it, and eventually the Japanese capture it. So it's actually not a complete victory over that ship. It's kind of like not that significant damage from torpedoes, even when you do hit them. So that leads to other tactics. So both sides use mines, underwater mines, that is to say bombs. And if your ship bumps into the bomb, it explodes and then your ship sinks. The difficulty, of course, is that your ships sometimes hit your own side's mines. And that's a really serious problem. And both of those kind of Japanese and Russian fleets have to deal with this issue. So mines are a little scary, which means that we can't use torpedoes. You can't really rely on mines. They're a little too dangerous. What's left? Well, what's left is big, powerful battleships, which will shoot all their guns at the enemy. I don't know if you could see here, but there's a kind of, oh, I guess it's the other way from your point of, wait, which way is it? I don't know which way it is. This way, I guess, from your point of view, which shows the letter T, the English letter T. This tactic is called crossing the T. I think you can guess, where are most of the guns on a ship? Are they in the front, the back, or on the sides? Because the ship is long and thin, it's going to be on the sides, which means if your ships are sideways and the enemy is coming like this, that's a very good advantage for your side. You can shoot all of your guns at them, but they can only shoot their front guns, which aren't so many, at your side. So that's called crossing the T, and it's very effective. So that's one thing, we have kind of crossing the T tactic, which emerges from this battle. Actually, it's an old tactic, but if that's the case, then in future wars, countries will want to invest a lot of money in battleships, which have big, powerful guns, which can shoot further than the enemy. And that's pretty much what everyone does. Japan, the US, Britain, they all start making large battleships. The bigger, the better. The more powerful the guns, the better. Assuming that this war and this specific battle, the Battle of Tsushima Strait, will show the future of naval combat. Now, ironically, it never happens again like this. This is the first and last time that there's a kind of textbook battleship fight. And it's just ships shooting each other with guns, cannons, and they manage to sink without using any other kind of weapons. So unfortunately, that means that many countries, including Japan, waste a lot of resources on battleships. Here's a good take-home message for you today. Battleships are completely ineffective, as it turns out. But in this one battle, they were useful. So everyone assumes that they're going to be very useful, but sadly, no. Well, what about on land? If that's what's happening in the naval combat, what's going on land? Well, it turns out that the Japanese army fights the biggest battle of world history up until that point. The Battle of Mukden, which is very northern Manchuria, kind of close to Russia. And there's a large Russian force and a very large Japanese force. They clash. The Japanese side wins, but kind of like it's not a complete victory. It's not a very one-sided victory. So it's almost like a kind of almost a draw in a sense. The Russian side retreats, so I guess the Japanese side wins by default, but it was an expensive victory, a costly victory. And you can see here, in terms of population, the Russians have a lot more soldiers than the Japanese and can bring a lot more soldiers into the battle. So that's worrisome, obviously, if you're on the Japanese side. And it may affect our negotiations at the end of today's kind of practice class. You can see the scale, though. They're marching into this terrible place, no offense, if you're from Mukden, the Mukden area, but it's just kind of wasteland. It's very cold. Both sides are kind of suffering in the conditions. This is in March, so it's very, very cold. But each side is able to send enormous armies into this place that nobody wants to go and fight a huge battle and risk everyone's life. So that shows the power of nationalism at the time. Each country is able to ask its citizens or subjects to fight in a place they don't care about, against an enemy they don't hate really, or at least not at first, and fight a terrible war with hundreds of thousands of casualties and over 150,000 deaths just from the war. Most of them are on the Russian side, but a lot of them are on the Japanese side too, at least 55,000. That's a lot of people to die. Someone did a study and the conclusion was, based on the number of young men in Japan at the time, everyone knew someone who had died in the war. I mean, that's remarkable, right? And then what about the people who survive in Japan, but they're injured? Maybe they lost an arm or a leg or something like that. There are visible reminders or kind of people you knew who never came home. They were killed. And that shows that even for the Japanese victorious side, there's a high cost for this war, and it's affecting people very powerfully. You can see here the scale too. I mean, this is nationalism at its peak. You have a country and they say, let's march off to a place we don't care about and fight a battle against people we don't hate. And everyone says, okay. But how long will they say, okay? Is there a limit to nationalism? Eventually, will one or the other side say, enough, we don't want to fight anymore, we give up? If the people say that, then the government may also have to say, let's negotiate, let's end the war. So people can put pressure, the regular people, just, ordinary people can put pressure on their government to end the war. Without that, it may be difficult to end the war. Well, you could see on the home front, there are lots of photos like this, which show that regular people are participating in Japan. They're waving their flags. They're not fighting, but they are supporting the war effort in meaningful ways. They feel like they're involved in this war. But there's a negative side to that too. They feel like they're involved, and that gives them a voice to say, we don't want to fight anymore at a certain point. And that's actually exactly what happens. What about in Russia? Well, it turns out in Russia, things are going very poorly indeed. So we have some kind of early 1905, there's a revolution, an attempt to overthrow the government. That's how unpopular the war is. And after the fleet, the Baltic fleet, the famous Russian fleet, was sunk in May of 1905, things get even worse. And we have a kind of clip here. Oh, sorry. We have a clip here from Sergei Eisenstein's movie 1925 called Battleship Potemkin. And in this clip, you'll see, we won't watch the whole thing, but you'll see some regular soldiers. They're not powerful individually, right? But they have a kind of collective power. They say, we don't like our treatment. Our officers are giving us rotten food. Gross. And so the officers come and they inspect it and say, no, it's fine. You should eat it. So there's a mutiny on board this ship. This is during the Russo-Japanese War. The movie is made later, but it's about this incident. This shows that even the Russian military is starting to say, we don't want to fight anymore. We've had enough. And that would maybe affect the Russian negotiations for the end of the war. Here's a guide to kind of what was sometimes called scientific racism. Actually, there's no scientific theory or evidence behind it, really. But in this worldview, which was very common about 120 years ago, the best, I guess, are white civilized peoples. Basically, this only means Germans, French, British, and Americans. That's kind of the only, those are the big four. There are other white people, like Russians or Southern Europeans, for example, like Spanish or Portuguese or whatever, Italians, but they're not considered quite as good, actually, under this system. They're almost as bad as everyone else, actually. The category of Japan is very interesting, though. Even though, obviously, people in Japan are classified as non-white, they are classified as civilized, partly as a result of victory in this war. And the fact that there's a constitution and so forth. So that's maybe good, I guess, for the Japanese kind of understanding of their place in the world. But note that everyone else in the world is not white and also not civilized. So it's a very racist system that's affecting decision-making at the time in troubling ways. For example, Tsar Nicholas II referred to the Japanese as yellow monkeys, not very nice. And the Russian side is infamous for mistreating civilians, regular people, not soldiers, but just people they encounter, Manchurian, basically Chinese people or whoever, treating them as just as bad as the Japanese, equally enemies. This is picked up by the international press. So they start criticizing the Russian lack of civilization or uncivilized behavior. On the other hand, the Japanese side treats Russian prisoners of war very well. They want to win the peace, not just the war, but also the peace. And that depends on how people perceive your country, not just who wins the battles. So that's interesting. Also, you can think about the kind of global implications of this. This is one of the famous anecdotes from the time. There's this figure, kind of Republican figure in China, who ends up becoming the father of the Chinese Republic, Sun Yat-sen. He has an interesting encounter in the Suez Canal. So he's going through the Suez Canal, which is near Egypt, and the Egyptian boat kind of handlers say, "Hey, you look Japanese. Good job. Keep fighting the Russians." And Sun Yat-sen, of course, privately was like, well, I'm not Japanese. I'm Chinese. But today, I feel like an honorary Japanese because this is a victory for everyone against all the imperialist forces, Russian or British or whoever. So it's a symbolic victory. And that's interesting. However, despite the popular sentiment that the war is worthy to be fought, like it's important to fight, there is still, even in Japan, some disagreement about what's going on. Here's an example of the kind of white privilege idea that the Japanese treat the Russians very well. But meanwhile, the Russians are treating regular people very poorly, and that's picked up as a contrast by the international press. Okay, what about this poem, though? This is published in September of 1904. It's written by Yosano Akiko, a remarkable woman who ended up having 13 children, which is kind of incredible all by itself. But she also accomplished many other things, like writing all these poems, probably the most famous of which is Kimi shini tamo koto nakare, or Oh my brother, you must not die in English. Here's the poem. In class, what we would normally do is we would read the poem, which is not very long, and then we would discuss how it would make you feel as a regular person in 1904. Remember, by 1904, someone you know has either already died at Port Arthur or is in danger there. So these kinds of stories, actually, it turns out it's not true, this story of like kamikaze attacks or something against the walls. That wasn't happening, but it sounded believable at the time. So how would you feel about this poem? What about this? Suppose your brother had already died, and now Yosano Akiko is writing this poem and saying, this war is not worth it. That's calling into question your own brother's sacrifice. How would that make you feel? So you could see that this is going to be very controversial poem. And in class, we would discuss that, and we would, in small groups, and we would come to some kind of conclusions about it. What we can say, though, pretty much for sure, is that the poem is a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the war and the legitimacy of the decision makers, including the emperor, who's sending off so many tens of thousands of young Japanese men to be killed. What are they dying for? Are their deaths worth it? How do we define these sorts of things? So, of course, some people are very upset at Yosano's poem. They throw rocks at her house, for example. But it's also popular among a segment of the population, despite being banned. In fact, maybe because it was banned. And it has an afterlife, too. So 50 years later, in the time of Kishi Nobusuke, the prime minister in the late 1950s, this is kind of popular protest chant that people will do, demanding that Kishi stop kind of pushing for US-Japan security alliance. So it's really interesting that this poem has such a powerful effect in the world. As the casualties continued to go up for the Japanese side, the poem gained in popularity over time. So maybe at the beginning in September of 1904, it's still controversial. Some people think, no, it's fine, we'll win and it'll be easy. But as the price of victory increases, and it does, into the tens, almost 100,000 Japanese are injured or killed in the war. Probably about 90,000 are injured or killed. How will that affect the population's willingness to keep fighting? So this all has to do with how is the war going to end? And, you know, how do regular people put pressure on their governments to push for peace? By the way, just a little side note, I think it's interesting that the Baltic Fleet, the Russian fleet, is discovered in the Tsushima Strait because it's obeying the rules. It has a hospital ship, like a medical ship, not a fighting ship. And according to the rules at the time, the rules of war, you're supposed to leave lanterns lit on your medical ship so that no one will attack the ship. It's a signal to everyone. Hey, don't attack this ship. You can attack the other ones, but not this one, right? But unfortunately, that means that when the Japanese side notices this ship going through the fog, it has lights on. So they see it and they think, oh, this is the Russian fleet. They have wireless telegraphy, so they can send messages to the rest of the fleet, in this case to the admiral, Togo, and say, we think we found the Russian fleet. But they discovered it partly because the Russians were obeying the rules. You know, if they had kept their lantern off, maybe the Russian fleet could have escaped detection, possibly. So that's just an interesting kind of feature. Sometimes it doesn't pay to obey the rules. That will perhaps explain later on when we talk about the Pacific War. You know, in the future weeks of regular course, we would talk about this. People start breaking the rules on both sides with tragic consequences. So anyway, Togo, when he hears the news that the Russian fleet has been sighted, he sends this famous telegram or telegraphic message. Honjitsu tenki seido naredomo nami takashi. I think you can guess what it means. Something like, I'm optimistic, the weather is good, but I'm a little worried about the possible consequences, but the waves are high. So, by the way, that was used by the late Abe Shinzo as a political rallying cry about 10 years ago. So there's some lessons for all of, kind of future wars, and some of them are very troubling, actually. For example, a lesson that the sneak attack, which began the Russo-Japanese War by the Japanese side, is a good idea. It's not just the Japanese who believe that, it's everyone but Russia, basically, who says, yeah, it's a good tactic to use. So that's interesting, considering the sneak attack that began World War II, which was not seen in such a positive way. So that's quite interesting. It also seems to reinforce this idea that, oh, all we need is a big victory. We draw the enemy in to some big battle. They commit all of their forces. It could be the Battle of Mukden on land, or it could be the Battle of Tsushima in the sea. We get their whole fleet there, and we crush them, and then they'll ask for peace. That decision-making idea, or that goal, is very powerful in World War II, 40 years later. Unfortunately, the war is not the same. Conditions have changed. So there's some reasons to doubt these lessons in the future. Anyway, we're almost at the end of our time today. So what we would normally do in class is have a kind of discussion in small groups about what to do. When should Japan ask for peace? Because Japan has won all the battles, so it seems like we can keep fighting forever. But what is the goal of fighting? And if the Japanese people seem unsupportive of a long war, then maybe we should change our minds and ask for peace. We don't have anyone else to send, and the war has been very expensive, of course, in people's lives, but also in money. So that could be a problem. What about Russia? How would the Russian decision-making process go? There is some pressure by the regular people against the war. But on the other hand, maybe if we fight one more battle, if we send a bunch more Russian soldiers to the front, and we fight one more battle, we could win, and then we could force the Japanese side to a lower negotiating point, like a kind of weaker position. So that could be an incentive to keep fighting on the Russian side. That brings us to the reenactment. So in class, what we do is we set up a kind of long, thin table, and the Japanese side, half the students are on one side, and the other half are playing the Russians, and they negotiate this kind of end of the war. What's really interesting is, yes, the Japanese side has won all the battles, so that seems like a strong negotiating position. But there's also this idea of Pyrrhic victory, a term which means a victory which is almost as bad as defeat. Meaning, after March 1905 and the Battle of Mukden, the Japanese side says, we can't afford any more victories like this. Yes, technically we won, but it was we sent all of our soldiers. Like we can't keep doing this. That means that the Japanese side asked for peace before the Russian side. That's really interesting, right? The Russian side has lost all the battles. But the Japanese side say, okay, we assume you've had enough, let's talk. And the Russian side says no, at least until they lose their fleet. So that's really interesting. And that means that in the negotiations, the Russians have kind of much stronger position than it seems, because they could keep fighting. It doesn't really matter to them. The Japanese side doesn't want to keep fighting despite having won. So we would talk about these demands the Japanese side has, and then the Russians have to decide how they will respond to these demands. And do they have any interesting tactics? And we reenact one of the famous tactics that was used in this actual negotiation, just to see how it would affect people in real time on the Japanese side. So that's the end for today. Oh, and I just wanted to show you this newsreel footage actually from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is where the peace treaty was signed. It's just interesting that we have this ancient footage, 120 years old now, of the negotiators arriving in Portsmouth. You see they sell ice cream. That's kind of cool. Even 120 years ago, people are eating ice cream. And they're arriving, and it's just historic footage. You know, the world is watching this negotiation. And the end result of this war will have huge implications for the rest of the 20th century. Here's the table itself that was used, a photograph of the two sides, Russians on the left and the Japanese on the right. A fascinating moment in world history. And if you want to reenact it, you can actually do it yourself by going to, well, near Nagoya. It's actually in Inuyama, but it's close to Nagoya. You can go to the place called Meijimura, and you can see the actual table that was used in the negotiations. Well, that's it for today. In our regular class, we would discuss all of these things. We would act it out. We would have some decision making. And that's the sort of thing you can expect if you come to AIU. So I hope you've enjoyed this little sample lecture. And in fact, if you have any questions, please try and ask someone at the Open Campus, and maybe they can get the questions to me and I'll try and answer. So thanks again and have a nice day.